Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. I want to thank everyone for joining the session today. Today's presentation is sponsored by Kalleid and entitled Successful Strategies for Completing Technical Documentation Projects. Before we get started, I want to take a few moments to cover a few orientation and logistics topics. First, in order to cut down on background noise, we have you muted throughout the presentation. You should see a small chat icon, though, in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. You can use this to ask any questions that come up for you during the talk. In order to maintain privacy, we have this chat function set to private, so no one besides myself will see your questions. We will have time at the end of the webinar, though, where I'll be sharing questions with our presenters, so don't hesitate to use that chat function to ask any questions that come up. And before we get into the presentation materials, we want to take a brief moment to tell you a little bit about Kalleid. So I'd like to introduce Mary Beth Walsh, the CEO of Kalleid, who will be presenting this information.
Great, thank you, Doug. So happy to be here today and share a little bit of background information before Jay jumps into the presentation. So we are a boutique scientific IT consulting firm based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We specialize in delivering various support services for complex software implementations, often involving multi-site organizations and global clients. We were established in 2014 and have a small staff of folks that have advanced scientific degrees, and we also have a global team serving multiple clients, and we have a number of collaborators we work with in Asia and Europe. Our clients include global pharmaceutical companies, biotechnology firms, as well as R&D software vendors. This slide shows the list of professional services that we offer to our clients. We like to take what we call an integrated approach to business transformation, recognizing that people are at the center of any technology change. We support more technical services such as testing and validation, as well as business analysis and data migration. In addition, we support the organization from a change management perspective, stakeholder engagement, strategic communications, as well as documentation and training. And for our R&D software customers, we also support producing content for them and working with them to launch their products. This slide shows an example of an integrated approach that we have applied in various services that we delivered in the context of a GXP-validated clinical supply chain application implementation for a global biopharmaceutical company. We provided services in multiple areas across multiple sites, including a change management assessment and plan. We also developed a strategic communication plan as well as the training plan, including the training materials development. We developed a set of user guides, which were very lengthy and supported the training and organizational use of the system. We also helped develop SOPs and support over 60 revisions. Finally, we delivered training and also supported user acceptance testing by writing the test scripts, working with the users to make sure those were executed properly, and document in the test summary report. Finally, we did support data migration and documentation, and we have resources who can support the technical migration as well as documentation of the migration itself. So I'm very pleased today to have Jay Martin, who leads our technical writing practice at Kalleid. He has been with us and has worked on several projects, and he's going to be sharing with you some of his best practices and learnings. Before joining us at Kalleid, he had a number of roles in the industry, supported radiochemistry, protein synthesis, other areas in biology. And as a tech writer, he is very seasoned and has worked with a variety of R&D scientists in various domains. And I'm really pleased to pass it over to Jay to share some of his learnings and insights.
Thanks, Mary Beth. I appreciate your introduction and happy to have everyone join us. I hope to tell the story of a strategy you can use to successfully complete a project that involves technical publications, or tech pubs, as I call them. So I'm going to briefly define what is technical documentation of the tech pub. What are the benefits of good technical documentation? The key elements of good execution, which will really encompass the strategy that I've developed over the course of my career. And I'll discuss some pain points. These will be in the form of pro tips that will be in the talk. Some of the blockers that you may commonly see and have you overcome. And then we'll put together, I'll try to put together for you at the end a case study where I'll basically sum up our story of finding the best strategy to get the tech pubs successfully through wherever you're working. This talk serves several purposes, and I want to mention one thing. I hope this talk also helps for you, the audience, to set some expectations of the tech writer if you're not one yourself. It's a complicated job, and it involves many different stakeholders, from marketing to product development to project management. The tech writer has to think through, not only understand the underlying technology, which I'll emphasize later, but they have to negotiate with these various stakeholders. I wanted you to, through this talk, to develop an appreciation of the tech writer, of how many skills that tech writers bring together: writing and editing, negotiation, project management skills. And again, Kalleid, having me on board and other people besides us, really can bring these skills to bear to get the tech pubs published. Some disclaimers I want to mention, and then I'll move on finally to the next slide. First of all, I'm speaking as an end-user science technical writer. So what does that mean? I'm primarily writing for end users, scientists and engineers. I understand and appreciate your audiences may be quite different. But again, I wanted you to appreciate that, tech writers live or work on a spectrum of skills and experiences. Some tech writers write specifically for software engineers, or they write for people who develop API documentation or code, and so they document the API. I sit on the usability sphere, the end user sphere, more or less. And so the final point I want to make before I move on is that while I'm going to emphasize primarily a strategy for getting tech pubs through, I think it's also important to realize that the tech writer is an advocate for the audience, for whom they're writing. They are an advocate to make sure that the product experience is as easy to follow as possible, that the product is as easy to use as possible. And that involves a great deal of usability, user experience practice, which again, I'm not going to emphasize so much in this talk. So if we move on, let's talk about briefly technical documentation. From an end user spectrum, I find it to be fairly straightforward. Technical documentation, or even more broadly, technical content, it helps a user perform a task, is to get work done. And it is a translation. The tech pub is really a translation from the engineering or biological complexities to something that the audience can follow step by step. It's procedural primarily, although, and I'll mention this in a moment, it can take many forms. I also want to mention that the tech publication is an intersection. And I think at Kalleid, we work on this very carefully, that a technical publication, a technical content, is really an intersection of the business needs with the end user needs. I know I oversimplify, but I think it's fair to say the business wants to make money. They want to make a profit. And the end user, again, wants to get the job done. So essentially, you want to write documentation that is complete, concise, and accurate. You want it to be spare, if anything. You want to say, let me just mention also, besides writing spare documentation, you want it to take a format that can be easily transmitted or delivered to the customer. So the technical documentation can be a PDF. And I must say, for expensive systems like next generation sequencing systems in biology, a customer not only expects but often demands a manual so that the details can be read thoroughly. But technical documentation can be something on a phone. It can be online help. It can be the text in the GUI. It can be just what's displayed in the firmware on an instrument. All of this is critical for delivery. Basically, I think that's just when I mentioned that. And I also want to mention the fact that technical documentation can be delivered by a variety of tools, whether it's Word or FrameMaker, which in the past, and I must mention, technical documentation has evolved over the years from those standard authoring tools to more complex tools like component content management systems, which are essentially databases that shuffle around topics that are meant for reuse in various formats and deliveries. So I think I've exhausted the definition of technical documentation. I'll be brief for the fact that I've already alluded to the audiences that I'm referring to in this talk are external as well as internal customers, and it may be developers or marketing people. The emphasis I want to put here is that the technical writer really has to keep in mind the audience in order to specifically write content that they can readily understand. And I also want to underscore the fact that even though you may be writing for internal customers, maybe internal SOPs, procedures that your companies need to follow, the same standards of excellence and quality, completeness have to be maintained. That's just the case. All right, so let's move on to the benefits of good technical documentation. I think one that I find consistently important in terms of benefits is saving money. Now, I'm not going to present to you a complex description of what the return on investment can be on good technical documentation, but efficient learning is important, but I would say that we need to have technical documentation that allow, for example, new hires and contractors to come on board and be educated on the technology that's available. And so if we can provide that kind of information to reduce the burden on training, and again, Kalleid not only provides good support for technical documentation, so as a training component, we're actually allowing you to have documentation for training. Kalleid can provide information through tech pubs, whether it be manuals or whatever you need, or quick references. More importantly, for external customers, I would say good technical documentation, if the documentation is read, reduces the burden on customer support. I don't know how many times I've been in corporations, and I've worked in many different places, even startups especially, where they have a knowledge base or where they have a customer support department, but it's very small. And so they want customers to read the manual, so they don't necessarily, first thing that occurs to them is to call customer support. We want to reduce the cost there. Let's go on to another benefit of operational efficiency. And, in a word, I think I can abbreviate this benefit to templates. I think it is an obvious secret, if you will, that a good technical writer will look for existing resources to begin writing content. And one of the first things, if a tech writer is onboarded, or one of the things they would like to develop, is a good template. And, a template basically locks in a certain organization and amount of content that be available. This kind of template may be described as an outline, if you will. It could be a Word document that provides this outline. It could be described as a book. That is a term that's used also in component content management system, where there's a pre-selection of topics. And the template provides the framework from which you can build your content. It can't be emphasized enough how much templates can help. And I will allude, I'll come back to templates in a moment, actually. Good documentation builds company value. And to me, the first thing that comes to mind, well, there are 2 points here. It's the idea of capturing generational knowledge. The idea that there is turnover at a company, but if you're able to lock in that kind of knowledge, then things aren't lost. You have a knowledge base in which you may have a suite of technical publications. It may be preparing for sequencing, for example. But the point is, even though ours change, you still have the repository, and a repository is very important wherever you go in terms of locking in that knowledge. In fact, when I work with some stakeholders, like R&D people, research scientists, I tell them, you know, you may think it's trivial, or you may want to put, you know, the development of your manuals on the back end of your projects. But frankly, and I think this is a very good strategy to gain the confidence of stakeholders, entrust them to you, and you tell them, you know, the knowledge you're giving me, we're translating to something that customers can follow. Your knowledge is going to be perpetuated. And that's where company value comes in, because you're also locking in and trusting your staff a certain loyalty to their work, because they know it's going to have longevity. Regulatory compliance. Absolutely. We're coming back to templates. There's some interlocking benefits here. Often templates lock in requirements for 21 CFR Part 11 in terms of safety alerts, or other matters regarding IVD, investigational new drugs. All of this comes into play with templates, and with ISO certification. Templates help with that, and I just want to mention that certainly tech pubs perpetuate that compliance. And once the documentation is published, you now have a foundation for a much easier threshold for software releases and product upgrades. The content is baked in, so to speak, and so incremental changes to your content, particularly made easy if you harness the power of component content management systems through content reuse, and the variabilization of product names and even procedures will help you perpetuate and reuse and get even more money out of your tech pubs. Lots of benefits to technical publication. And your tech pubs become good marketing collateral. Your tech pubs can be pitched to people to show, for example, what's involved in, say, a site installation, or what needs to be done to, I don't know, perform not only just sequencing, but bead preparation for certain platforms in science. That's a very, I'm sorry, I gave you a very arcane idea, but you know, it's a very competitive environment, for example, in biology. And if a customer is able to look at a manual, say, from one company to another to say, oh, look how much easier it is to prepare my so-called beads that may have DNA encapsulated in them, I'm going to go with this company. So you can see the tech writer, especially an experienced one, has to strategize here and say, look, how am I going to win over the customer here? And what's the best way I can provide the greatest usability or portray the greatest usability or ease of use of this product through what I'm writing? And, well, I just mentioned it. The only point I want to make about the benefits of good technical writing here is to make sure that the customer can find the information he or she needs at the time they need it. This is especially important in contextual help, where a person comes across something in a software, and what do you know? There's some online help that is particularly relevant to that person at the time when they're trying to get through very complicated software. So I think we can move on here, and let's get into a little bit more into the weeds of strategy and best practices, documents. And so now I present kind of an overview of the workflow that might encompass this so-called strategy. And, we can talk about creating a doc plan, and we are to some degree. We can talk about review schedules and release protocols and managing the project and creating an update schedule. But I think as I talk through it, I want you to keep in mind 3 phases of the strategy of launching a good TechCom project. One is the planning phase, which includes steps 1 and 2 of planning of the doc plan and review schedule. And then there's a development phase we can talk about in terms of release and management. And in the management phase, we're going to talk a little bit more about the tech writer getting very involved with the technology and the content. And then the last step 5 is a maintenance phase. And I'm going to talk a little bit about avoiding churn. So a lot of the strategies, not only success of putting together clear and complete, accurate documentation, it's not having to reinvent the wheel also. You want to be efficient, cost-effective also. So let's get a little bit into the document plan. The document plan, a lot of information here. But I have to say, before I begin any project, TechCom project, TechPubs project, I have to have a doc plan. It's a living document that addresses the 5 W's, who, what, when, where, why, and the how. Who are you writing for? Who's the audience? That's very important. And the W for who also is, who's your team? I'm going to be jumping around a little bit with the slides, so forgive me. Who's your team? Who's actually going to be reviewing your document, your content, and making all those edits? And who's actually going to be approving the document in a quality management system, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Very critically identify these team members, these stakeholders, because the reviewers, you want to cast a wide net for reviewing the document. We'll get to that. But it's actually the approvers you really want to focus on in terms of getting the document out the door. What's the documentation? Very important. I'm not going to, I'd say, that can be a user guide. And then if you have a user guide, you're going to have a quick reference. The software, is the software explicit enough that you don't need online help, or does it demand online help? And again, the strategy is, are you going to overwhelm the customer, your end user, with a lot of online content, with a lot of online help, or are you going to provide a software, a GUI, a user interface that is so simple to use you can actually eliminate some of the deliverables? These are the things that you can grapple with in a documentation plan. So let me get through this. So you have a list of deliverables. You have, hopefully at this point, IDs that correspond to the quick quality management system you're using, your platform for reviewing and approving the document. You have existing resources. What are your style guides? Do you have a branding document? Or are you following Chicago Manual of Style? Boy, it sounds boring, but let me tell you, it's very important for the team to understand the tone, how you're going to sound, what the look and feel is going to be of the document, which is encompassed in the branding. What kind of tools are you going to use? Are you going to kind of grind through Word and or FrameMaker authoring tools, which are a little bit older tools and maybe the only tools that you can use? Or are you going to take 2 years of development to create a content management system, which we hope offers good return on investment through ease of topic reuse? Also, the how are you going to write your documents? The doc plan can encompass this. Outline what your each deliverable is going to do. What are the topics you're going to present? And what's the schedule? When are things going to be due? What's the launch date? Reach those milestones. And as I said, The doc plan is a living document, and I heartily recommend that there is a kickoff meeting with the tech writer and the team as part of your strategy to introduce yourself, get to know the team and their personalities. A lot of tech pubs development is psychology. It's using those negotiation skills, again, which Kalleid is very expert at doing, to be able to understand what the agendas are of each of the stakeholders and to reach compromise in all of those thousands of edits that will ultimately result in a successful tech pub. So, and again, I'm assuming the paradigm here is the tech writer, or even a team of tech writers working with a team of departments. So, okay, so we've covered that. So why don't we move on to the review schedule? This is the next point. So we've gone from planning, and now we're going in a little bit from planning to a little bit toward, now we're getting to planning to development, document development phase of our workflow, part of the overall strategy. And here with the review schedule, you've already identified your subject matter experts. They're going to be the source of the value and accuracy of the document. They're already going to be approving the initial outlines in your doc plan. And they will be providing the feedback, these reviewers. And so I also want to mention too, it says review schedule, and I'm also outlining the actors involved in the review schedule towards document development. I would say as you begin to develop the documents that you have a single point of contact. For each department, there may be a bunch of reviewers, but try to have a single point of contact, that chief reviewer who will curate and make decisions about those edits. And those decisions about those edits will come about through something called a review cycle. A review cycle during this, which is part of the review schedule, is where the tech writer will draft the publication, and that person, the tech writer, will send it out through shared review, and maybe in an email, or maybe Adobe Acrobat shared review, or maybe some mechanism through a content management system. And, it's going to be out there online in some platform. That's part of the review cycle, the review phase. But you also need to have a writing session when the review cycle is going on. What's a writing session? A writing session is when, you're actually faced with the technical content and you have your stakeholders either on site. Well, good luck with that with the pandemic, but you have them online in real time, and you actually work through words and steps and procedures, coming up with the clearest content and accurate content available. So that's the writing part, but it's also about editing. So there may be, through the review cycle, a bunch of marginal edits that need to be discussed, if not thrashed about between all the stakeholders. Remember, they have their agendas. So the tech writer has to negotiate and think through with good communication skills how best to capture the meaning of the workflow, of how the workflow is going to work. So early in my career, I thought you needed only 2 review cycles to get a typical user guide or something out the door. No, I think strategy has changed over time, and strategy has become strategies. Basically, you need to gauge, again, the culture of your business, the cooperation of each of the stakeholders, and you need to have as many review cycles and writing sessions as needed to make sure you stay on top, if not a little bit ahead of the curve on the content. It's very important to do that. So let's continue. So we're now heading into the development phase, and there are other things you need to keep in mind with good strategy. Okay, yeah, I mentioned have as many writing sessions as necessary to get things done. So I mentioned a little bit something about the soft skills of a tech writer, but also the infrastructure is so important with good tech pub strategy. I can't emphasize enough how a good quality management system, and I'm talking about a platform for so-called reviewing and approving documents, is for the strategy. I can recount a story when I was working at a startup not too long ago. It was a startup that actually did single cell sequencing of cells. In other words, basically the sequence the DNA, the whole genome of each cell from tissue, from a particular piece of tissue. And the quality person was hired on, fairly new, a little bit inexperienced, and just used an open source quality management system. I don't even remember the name of the system. It's not really that important, but just it's a piece of software that allows you to upload the software, review it, and then just say yes or no towards its approval. And it also tracks revisions, revision control, very important, which I didn't even touch on here, but it's critical. But the point I'm making is, that startup was bought out by a much bigger company. And as it turns out, the QMS, the quality management system, was not a validated system. And so the bigger company, the bigger fish, insisted on a validated QMS. And so a lot of the documentation that already had gone through and been released through the QMS wasn't so much invalidated, but a lot of it had to go through the validated QMS system. So I can't emphasize enough the importance of having the appropriate platforms from writing to quality systems to get things through. And the right departments too. I would say that the tech writer and the quality person, and if there's a regulatory person, are very close cousins. They're like blood brothers and sisters. They really need to work closely together, that all the boxes are checked in terms of regulatory compliance. All right, and again, this kind of close coordination is so important, and is a skill that tech writer has, and I can't tell you how many times Kalleid, in its current projects and in the past, worked so closely with quality and with product management and the project manager to make sure things go smoothly. So let's go on. Now we're into the full stage and the full bloom of the development of the tech pubs. And I'm going to bring up some bullets here that really get into the strategy of understanding. What do I mean by that? I mean, the tech writer not only has a role of being an advocate for the end user, but that tech writer also has the responsibility to put their shoes and put their feet into the end user's shoes. And I mean to get really involved, involved enough into the technology and in the software so that they have a fundamental understanding of what they're writing about. How can a tech writer really identify gaps in information or wrong information or the wrong workflow, but there are too many bifurcated steps in a manual that completely confuses the end user when there can just be a single workflow of information? How can that tech writer do that unless they interview the subject matter experts, they have meetings one-on-one besides the writing sessions, they have meetings one-on-one with the stakeholders, particularly with the scientists and the developers, get to grasp what is being accomplished here. And this could be, for example, doing something in bioinformatics where you want to analyze all that DNA sequence. What does it mean? What genes are being upregulated or downregulated? What does an end user need to do? What kind of metrics need to be derived from that? The tech writer needs to know something about those metrics, for example, that the customer would want to know. It's just to be managed properly. Well, I'm getting into that. And it involves facilitation of all parties. Well, let me give you a more concrete example of that. It not only involves just interviews with stakeholders. I think the tech writer needs to get get onto the floor of the business. And in my case, it meant to get into the lab and do the pipetting steps, doing the experiments also, or at least shadowing through contextual inquiry. A very important discipline in TechCom, by the way. Shadowing the stakeholder to have an understanding of what the customer is going through, so that when they go and write the procedure, the tech writer can practically do it himself or herself, not just the scientist. This is part of the strategy of development, of having good knowledge about the work so you can write it clearly. So, and then, yes, review and release process must be coordinated and managed, and we've discussed that. So let's move on then to the idea that the quality management system is used, and the documents are developed, and then they're ultimately published. Let's assume the documents are published, they're out there, they're posted on a website. And by the way, traditionally, I've seen the trend being, and it depends on the business, a lot of companies, particularly in the biotech space, provide nearly all the tech pubs, the manuals, the quick references that the customer needs. There's not a lot of fuss to gain access to that information, and it should be done within a few clicks on the corporate website. I did want to mention that. And it should be easy from my perspective, perhaps from Kalleid's perspective also, for the customer not only to access the information, but then be able to use the information. The customer can use the information in their own way. It's a full expectation, at least for me as a tech writer, for, say, a scientist or any end user to even copy-paste content from a PDF and to put it in a spreadsheet if they find it easier for them to follow the workflow. So that happens, and it's very common. And I think a tech writer should anticipate reuse of content according to the customer, how they want to use it. Of course, you want the customer to be able to use the tech pub as is, but in the real world, that's not always the case. All right, so getting back to an update schedule, what I'm really talking about here is the maintenance stage of the workflow as part of the strategy. And I think as a tech writer, to really be very effective, you have to abide by, first of all, compliance requirements. Sometimes you have to regularly update content through quarterly revisions. That's required by the FDA. ISO compliance, probably so. I'm not as familiar with ISO 9001 requirements for releasing updates or revisions of documentation. But the real emphasis I want to put here, and I'll bring up the next about regular review and updates. Sure, after something is published, you need to know exactly when documents are going to need to be revised. But the emphasis I want to put on this slide is to avoid churn. I think good strategy in tech publications is to make sure you do not unnecessarily put out one revision after another, within weeks of a time, unless it's part of the corporate mandate to make sure everything is updated. And sure, online content can be updated on the fly, but larger pieces of content, to avoid confusing the customer, make sure that there is stability about the content. And if that requires, in some cases, if it requires making sure that the scientific procedures are stable and are nailed down, if it takes a little bit more time with that, if it means genericizing or variabilizing content so that it can apply to many different situations, or that you can put output various versions of central content that it applies to different aspects of doing different work. Oh, I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head, but a very facile example. If someone wants to print a protocol, you might want to provide printable content in one type of manual, or address one type of user, an administrator in one type of manual, but an end user another type of manual. make sure all these things have been planned out and published accordingly so you don't have to go back and say, oh, I didn't have anything planned for the administrator. Now we have to write an admin guide. We have to include also user instructions in the admin guide. Avoid the churn. And then finally, learn from your lessons. In the maintenance phase, have a come to Jesus moment, if you will. Certainly have a lessons learned meeting and go round robin to see, what was the experience of each of the stakeholders? Did things go well? Did you get annoyed? Did you like the process that Kalleid, for example, Kalleid set up with writing sessions, review cycles? Was it very uncomfortable? Did we annoy you? Did we send too many emails? And by the way, if you sent too many emails, you better have more writing sessions to avoid that kind of stuff. Note what went wrong. Make sure that doesn't happen again. Look at the customer support databases also to see if there are any feedback or even complaints, to see if the content, the publications can be re-engineered so that there perhaps will be fewer or clearer feedback. Maybe your tools are not appropriate, or maybe you need to negotiate better with your stakeholders and get different Spocks. I don't mean the one from Star Trek. I mean the single points of contact again, to make sure they curate and make better decisions. So on that note, after maintenance, let's discuss a case study where we're going to put all this together in terms of strategy. And I'm going to be talking about an experience that Kalleid had very recently with a big global pharmaceutical company in New England. They're trying to build, or have been building, a cell therapies manufacturing facility using so-called CAR-T technology for targeting T cells to cancer cells in patients, particularly patients, I believe, CAR-T is used specifically for B-cell lymphoma treatments. So that was the case, and the big pharma had requirements, and believe me, and this included 4 different systems to build the infrastructure for this cell therapies facility: networking, security, Active Directory, and computer storage. These are all IT-based infrastructure that was required in order to ferret harvested cells and transforming them and then formulating them and putting them in bags and transfusing patients. This infrastructure had to be built, and it needed documentation. All this had to be 21 CFR Part 11 compliant. And so, as a result, Kalleid was asked to step in. And why? Because the big pharma didn't really have the resources, the TechCom experience to support these 4 systems with good tech pubs. They were opening the facility on a tight deadline. It was high risk. And Kalleid had the skill sets to be able to write these tech pubs, or at least facilitate their writing. I'm going to get into that in a minute. And again, we had the experience with TechCom, and then we came in. And we had to implement process. If you've taken anything away from the strategy here, that successful tech pubs publication also means implementing good process. And, I've really summarized that in terms of review cycles, the writing sessions, and process is encapsulated in the platforms, the quality management systems that you need, version control. All that needs to be there. And Kalleid certainly had the consultation services needed to get this job done. So let's talk a little bit about the business challenge. I mentioned many of these. Implement a framework for writing review cycles. Coordinate now. I didn't mention this, but I alluded to it, that there are many departments and stakeholders. And in this case, I'm going to get to in a second, there were many departments. There was IT, there was the business or biology side of the documents, of the facility that needed to be involved. There was a project manager or 2 or 3 involved also. All that needed to be coordinated properly. And as I mentioned, or I'm going to mention now, Kalleid was stepping into, as I mentioned in this case study, the facility involved multiple groups around the world, different time zones, different cultures, different expectations and what the tech pub should look like. The writing skills were quite different. And not only that, but these were all regulatory documents. You know, the writing skills may be different, but you know something, those requirements for 21 CFR had all to be met. So what did we do? We built the documentation plan. So I came in there and we basically built a giant doc plan that included the 4 systems like the Active Directory and data storage and so forth. It included all the deliverables that were required and when they were due and the 4 sets of teams that were required. Everything that you would think a decent doc plan should have, and I kept it up to date, and I kept the project managers in the loop. So negotiating and teamwork skills were of the essence. But then what? You know, I mentioned the fact that challenge was having these engineers help write the document. So Kalleid, you know, worked not only with the engineers, but we worked with other consultancies that were invited to work in the cell therapies project to actually educate the engineers and other stakeholders in how to use templates to write the necessary compliant documentation. And as it turns out, a lot of the consultancies had good validated templates. So Kalleid leveraged the expertise of other consultancies, not only to teach the engineers how to write well based on styles, guides, and things that the big pharma had available to us, but they had the templates that organized the information. And so one consultancy worked with another to teach, and we scheduled writing sessions together, and we had templates rolled out. It was quite the experience. And I must say it was ultimately a successful one. Now, and so we trained the engineers, and we had the review sessions, but I do want to mention also that if we got stuck and there were blockers during this experience, during this case study I'm presenting to you, it was necessary to escalate situations. If an engineer didn't write the content they needed, I might consult with someone else in another consultancy to say, hey, can you get this person to do it? Or I would talk to the project manager and so forth. So, you know, with a complex project, you're not only dealing with complex material, you're dealing with complexity of personalities, and you need to work with them, sometimes even one-on-one. So that's why there's not just a single strategy to get things through. It's not just review cycles. It's dealing with people and language and ideas that come out to the customer. And then there was the usual content management, release. Kalleid drove content management. We did use a QMS called Leads to be able to drive through the 4 sets of documentation through Leads. And I do want to mention that it's a good strategic skill and a good practice, although there's no pro tip here, I don't believe, to make sure all the documents are reviewed first before you put it in a QMS platform like Leads. Because the QMS platforms typically have very poor review interfaces. Best to get all that business out of the way first, get it on Leads, and have sequential sign-offs of the documentation. It's just a signing off in the QMS. Again, a validated QMS to get the documents through. And we did, and we worked closely with quality, as I mentioned before. And I find quality to be the police, the cops, if you will, in this whole endeavor. Almost in any project, they have the final say, as well as regulatory, to make sure the work is done according to compliance requirements. So ultimately, we met the aggressive schedule. We delivered the 4 sets of 4 documents, 16 documents, and these include installation and operational qualifications and trace matrices and Yeah, and maintenance documents for the four systems that built the infrastructure for cell therapies. We have an ongoing content review process. The stakeholders have now been educated on what they need to do and the various platforms and how to think about documents for these end users. And we've complied. We've laid the foundation so that we can now erect the cell therapy facility so that ultimately the cancer patients can now get their treatments. So that ultimately is a successful implementation of a good TechPub strategy to help people, particularly patients who might die unless they get the help from our industry. Okay. Any questions?
Well, thanks, Jay. That was great. Yeah, we did have a couple of questions that came in during the presentation. One was, what are some of the biggest challenges you've faced in technical documentation projects?
Well, the biggest change I alluded to in the case study is silos. Basically, where one department isn't talking to another, their agendas are quite different. For example, product management is, is most concerned in getting documentation or the product out the door with not a great emphasis on the tech pubs, unfortunately. Often, traditionally, tech pubs are left last. They want to get the products developed and they want them sold. That's product management. I'm generalizing, but generally that's their point of view. R&D or anyone who's developing product or software developers, they want something to be great. They want a successful product, a technology that will empower customers to do things. And sometimes these agendas collide in terms of scheduling, to push back and so forth. And ultimately that translates into publication stalling out. People won't agree to edits because they need more time to develop the technology. But no, the product's going out April 1st. Let's just get the publications out. We can revise after the product launch. So in that situation, and it came up, for example, at the startup I was mentioning earlier about the QMS, I escalated. So I go to the project manager and I say, look, these people need to talk to each other. The project manager said, well, this is documentation. You do something about it. So I had to call a meeting between product management and the R&D single points of contact to hash things out. And we ultimately agreed to a compromise to allow, to reach the next milestone in technology development, to clear up the necessary edits, but still meet the milestone. So that was a big challenge. I can mention another one, unless you said you had a second question?
Yeah, we have one more question, time for one more question. So if you want to just, add a few comments on this one, and I'll give you the second one here.
Well, I can mention one. There was one case where the R&D insisted on these little quick references. They seem to have not anything connected with each other. It was very hard. I mean, from the standpoint of a tech writer or who was an advocate for the customer, it was very hard to follow the procedure that was necessary to get the work done. And I'm happy, since you're seeing my screen, I am going to shove, it's a little bit of a surprise here, but I'm showing you, so each of these boxes here show a different quick reference to be able to get things done. This is for single cell sequencing. And this is published, by the way, or was published. This is from a few years back. I'm not even sure if this project is still out in the market. But the point I want to make here is I thought, okay, we need to organize these deliverables, these little quick references here, so that they make sense. There's a flow. So here is a flow chart where the customer goes to this document first. We kind of force the end user to this document. And they can see, oh, I need to go to this number. In fact, these are active links. I say so somewhere in the document that these are active links. It should be somewhere here. Click on it, read what you need to do, and then at the branch point, go to the appropriate next step. So this was a way to solve the case where you have so many deliverables. You solve the problem of, why do I care about all these documents? And then you say, okay, because there's a logical workflow to ultimately sequence and analyze the single cell DNA. Yet another question.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Jay. Second question. What should I consider in the decision on whether or not to hire an external contractor to do my technical documentation?
Well, I think I emphasized this during my talk. You need to someone who has the knowledge and the experience to integrate all the skills I talked about as a technical writer. Not only just be able to write decently and write in global English, by the way. I didn't emphasize the fact there's a certain way of writing technical content that can be universally understood. You use articles like the and a and words like that. You need someone who has good writing and editing skills, and you need someone who has excellent project management skills too. They can understand how to resource stakeholders appropriately and make sure that the milestones and deadlines are realistic enough, just with good knowledge of just how long these things take. So if you have a project of complexity with many deliverables and many interlocking pieces, that's when I think you need an experienced tech writer. And I hope you hire someone from Kalleid.
Well, thanks so much, Jay. That was a wealth of really valuable information. So I think we're going to end it on that note. And in closing, I want to thank everyone for attending this webinar on successful strategies for completing technical documentation projects. Hope everyone enjoyed the session. Jay, if you can move to the next slide here.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
So if you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to Jay directly. You can see his email on the screen here. You can also go to the Kalleid website at kalleid.com and fill out our contact form. Just mention that you're on the technical documentation webinar and let us know your questions, and we'll get that to the right people, which will probably be Jay. In addition, we'll be posting more helpful information about technical documentation best practices in the future on our blog, which you can find at our website. You can see the link below Jay's email here on the screen. And finally, we'll be sending all the registrants to this webinar an email in a day or two with a PDF copy of the slides and a video of the session, so look for that. Okay, well, this webinar is now complete. Thanks again for your attendance, and we hope you all have a great afternoon.